Here's another E. E. Cummings poem that is, at first, disorienting to students. Remember that E. E. Cummings is all about challenging conventions. He does that not to confuse us, but to force us to think in new and creative ways. That, I think, is always the hope of the avant-garde artist, to pull us out of our intellectual comfort zones and help us to see things in new ways. In this poem, Cummings is upsetting our expectations of word order. Let me read it, and then we'll see what we can make of it. Spring is like a perhaps hand, which comes carefully out of nowhere, arranging a window into which people look, while people stare, arranging and changing, placing carefully there a strange thing and a known thing here, and changing everything carefully. Spring is like a perhaps hand in a window, carefully to and fro moving new and old things, while people stare, carefully moving a perhaps fraction of flower here, placing an inch of air there, and without breaking anything. Okay, well, just as spring and nature are important concepts in the poem 9, spring is also an important subject in this poem. It's really not all that difficult poem if we remember that Cummings is just altering the normal word order. Take the first line, for example. Normally, we would put the perhaps at the beginning of the line or at the end. Perhaps spring is like a hand, or spring is like a hand, perhaps. We wouldn't find such wording difficult at all. So why doesn't Cummings just say that? Why confuse everything? My guess is that he wants to call special attention to the word perhaps. He wants to heighten the reader's awareness that this is a possible metaphor of what spring is like. It does place a good bit of responsibility on the reader, and I think that is always true of avant-garde artists. They do expect a lot from their audiences. They expect their audiences to approach the material as creatively as they do. Okay, what else do we have going on here? Spring is like a perhaps hand, which comes carefully out of nowhere, arranging a window into which people look, while people stare, arranging and changing, placing carefully there a strange thing and a known thing here, and changing everything carefully. Let's do a little word and phrase shifting and read it like this. Perhaps spring is like a hand that comes out of nowhere, arranging a window into which people look, placing a known thing here and a strange thing there, changing everything carefully while people stare. Makes more grammatical sense when we arrange the words that way, doesn't it? Then why doesn't Cummings just write it that way? I suspect because he doesn't just want our eyes to glide over the words once and go on to something else, like many students read poems. He wants us to slow down and back up and consider word relationships. He wants us to linger over that capitalized word nowhere and consider its connotations. He's got 3 ing words in one line: arranging, changing, placing. Those are all synonyms, but they aren't identical. He uses carefully 3 times in that first stanza. It's the only word that is used 3 times, suggesting something about the nature of spring. In my rewording, I only use carefully once. The emphasis is subtly changed. Let's take another look at the second stanza. Spring is like a perhaps hand in a window, carefully to and fro moving new and old things, while people stare carefully, moving a perhaps fraction of flour here, placing an inch of air there, and without breaking anything. Okay, let's adopt a more conventional word order. Perhaps spring is like a hand in a window, carefully moving new and old things to and fro, while people stare, carefully moving a flower, a fraction here, placing an inch of air there, and without breaking anything. But again, why not just say that? Because the poet wants to heighten our awareness of the subtlety and flexibility of language. In my rephrasing, carefully is an adverb modifying the moving of the new and old things. But in the original phrasing, carefully could also refer to how people stare. The meaning is more flexible in the original phrasing. The second perhaps I didn't even need when I rephrased it. But in the original, it might refer to the fraction of flour or to the moving of that fraction of flour. Now, sometimes students say, you know what? I don't care. And I understand that. In order to take E.E. Cummings seriously, one must care about language and its subtleties. I do care about that because I think the ideas that we carry around in our heads are largely the products of the language that we're exposed to and the phrasing that we're exposed to. To the extent that we're more aware of that language and its subtleties and ambiguities, the more capable we are of understanding meanings on the surface and beneath the surface. Language people, like English teachers, think a lot about those things. Many students don't. But I would suggest those things are worth thinking about. Okay, so can we get to something practical like subject and theme? Once again, the subject is nature. We might even go a bit further and say the subject is spring. If E.E. Cummings were alive and could hear this podcast, he would be mightily distressed because he would insist that I am removing all the subtlety and thus the real meaning from the poem. But for students who sleep better, when they have a theme to put in their notes, we might say something like this. The theme is that nature's work is both visible and invisible. We stare at its work in amazement. On one level, we see it happening. We see the grass turning green and the flowers blooming. But in another way, we don't see it at all. From day to day and week to week, we can see the grass getting green, but if we just stare at the grass, we can't see it change from moment to moment. And even though over time we can see the grass turning green, the flowers blooming, the weather becoming nicer, at times we're blind to just what a miracle that is. It's like an invisible hand working miracles. This poem, like most of E.E. Cummings' poems, is not as hard as it first appears if we know how to approach it.